the 8th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 19th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are in this growing season as we continue to talk about that. I think it's also this moment here with the text that we're having from last week and this week. They kind of flow together really well, but it's a really good reflection, really good moments for, am I growing? Am I doing what I need to be doing? Last week we talked about soil. This week we talk about weeds, but this aspect of how we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep doing self-evaluation to make sure that we continue to grow. And that's something that can be very difficult. It can be something that's very challenging, but it also is very necessary for us to keep that growth going and evaluating where are we at with this and keeping that conversation with God going. And we can see that this week when we look at the text, how important that is, how vital that is for us to be making sure that we're doing that. But before we get to this week's text, we have to look back to last week, and let's look at the question for last week, which was, where do you see yourself naturally being selfish instead of being a blessing? And I think one of the easy ones, especially being in the West, is our consumption of resources. There's a lot of times even just simple things like electricity or things we take for granted that we're seeing kind of in the World Cup right now of like air conditioning. There's things like this that we take for granted. And yes, there's efficiencies and stuff that we've done, but there's also times where we get into this consumption culture with it as well. And just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. So this aspect of how at times there's things that are normal that we need to at times question, why is this normal? Is this healthy for this being normal? And I think that's the type of things that can help us propel and move us forward in a new and marvelous way, but it means it takes a lot of self-evaluation and a lot of work. So let's just jump into it for this week. The one of the Old Testament texts that you can have is from Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 19a. This is fast forwarding a little bit into that Jacob and Esau's story. Jacob and Esau now are in a fight as the birthright has been given to Jacob. He has gotten the blessing from his father, so he goes and runs. And in the middle of the night, he puts his head down in the middle of the desert where he has some stones and has this dream, and he gets this ladder appearing in front of him, going from heaven to earth with angels coming up and down, and the reaffirmation of how God is going to bless his descendants. Now, he is of Abraham, and so this is that continued promise of, I didn't just stop with those promises of your ancestors and your grandfather. This is something that is going to continue moving forward and is going to continue to be something of blessing for what I am trying to lead us into. And so this is then where we get the place of Bethel, because of where God is coming down and containing and answering questions for Jacob. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 139, the first 12 verses of it, and then 23 and 24. And this is then a psalm going through how God knows your inmost parts, your thoughts. He knows you're lying down and you're getting up. And this recognition on how all this knowledge, all this stuff that God has and understanding of is just mind-blowing to us. And recognizing how God is using it for good. And that in that we can see the light of who God is and steering us away from the darkness. And recognizing that we need to continue to turn our thoughts to God. We then also have alternative Old Testament readings, and in that we then have two alternatives of that. So first of all, being from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 12, starting at verse 13, and then also 16 through 19. And this is that recognition again on how strong and sovereign God is, and that strength continues to be shown to us. And thus we get to see that more and more of the character of God, of the fair judge, the one who is able to teach us in righteousness from that. But it's also recognizing that God is not unjust with us, that God is having this desire to be righteous and sovereign and a strength for us. as long as we are willing and able to lean into that. The other alternative Old Testament text then would be from Isaiah chapter 44, verses 6 to 8. And this then is recognizing the sovereignness of God, the recognition on how there is no one like God, and there hasn't been before, and there won't be after. This recognition on we have this God who is unlike anything we've ever seen, and thus we do not fear because we are witnesses to who that God is, and also the connection that God is wanting to have with us. The psalm that then goes with those two is Psalm 86, starting in verse 11 to 17. And this is that cry out for us to recognize and understand who God is. Teach us the way of truth. Give us a heart that recognizes the thanks that we should be giving, the steadfast love that is being delivered. This idea of how gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, coming from verse 15, being gracious, teaching us to have the strength of a servant, all these things to help us recognize who God is and embedding that within us. The epistle text or New Testament text then this week is out of Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 12 to 25. And this then is the text of how our flesh may die, but the spirit that is within us, that is of God, does not die. It's not the thing that steers us astray. It's the thing that drives us closer to God. And in doing that, we also then, as we embrace the Spirit of God, we recognize that we are heirs with God, and thus we are welcomed into the inner family of God, and we are part of the suffering of what Christ did for us, also renews us and moves us forward and recognizes that then we are this new creation because of that. And how do we live then differently because we are this new creation versus the body that is temporary, that passes away? And how do we then juxtapose these positions and recognizing that our body is temporal, but our eternal spirit is forever? The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30 and 36 through 43. Here we are getting another parable from Jesus, and it's this recognition on how an enemy has come in and sown weeds into a field. And so they ask, what should we do? And instead of the slaves pulling the weeds for fear of actually taking the desired crop along with that, it's this recognition on they're going to grow together, and at the harvest, there'll be this separating of the weeds from the grain and the wheat that will go into the barn. And then we get this explanation of this, that we are the children of God, are the wheat, the desired crop, versus the weeds of the evil one. And thus the weeds are going to be burned. We are being moved into the barn, and it's the angels that are being the reapers of this. And that the description then we get from Jesus on how this is going to be troubling at this time, the furnace of fire, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, this recognition on how God has these desires, but then all the evil one can make things more difficult for us going forward. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves, podcasts, or commentaries, or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and just some different ways of looking at these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having hymns, colors, daily readings to get you into these texts. And like we've been talking about, also how they're revamping their art section and being able to look at how art has been interpreted for these texts over many generations, over many parts of the world. I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be brought into the weekly lectionary, similar to this podcast, but more with an ecological lens on it, or checking out the Green Blades Rising publication, which takes all that, comes out more as a monthly newsletter, along with a couple additional event notices and different environmental aspects and things to be thinking about with these texts and just within your everyday life and potential preaching as well. So if you haven't checked out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable or the Green Blades Rising publication, that'll be the first link down in the references section, and I'd highly recommend checking that out. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument, where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. That's the second link down in the references section. It does a great job in everyday language being able to talk about how science and faith do not compete against each other, but support each other to be able to help all of us have better understanding of our faith and using science to help support that faith. It's an amazing thing if you enjoy this podcast and you enjoy that read. So I'd highly recommend checking that out. And that's the second link in the references section. When we think about this idea of wheat and weeds and how do we deal with this as Jesus continues with these parables week after week, I think there is something that we've talked about before that I think is vital for us to understand again. And I think it also shows how, again, God has built in structures for us and things that we need to be considering. But then I think it also gets us into recognizing how God is beyond what we're seeing, and thus being able to get our eyes and heads around that concept to be able to move us forward to move into directions on where God is trying to steer us. So let's talk about the weeds and the wheat. We have these weeds being sown in to the wheat, and yet they're told to remain there. And I find that very interesting because we have talked about this type of thing because mycelium can be used. It's a type of fungi that is allowing plants to essentially make their own internet system where they're able to communicate and send nutrients back and forth. And it's not uncommon for some of these different weeds per se to try to tap into that network and be able to get some of these sugars and things of that nature or different nutrients as well. But that also means that there is still potential that these weeds could be providing some type of nutrients as well in the fields as all these transactions are happening. So I do find it interesting how here is Jesus talking about this 2,000 years before we ever figured this out, this aspect of how there's communication networks and pulling the weeds potentially at minimum could sever some of the connections, much less taking some of the plants out and wrecking the harvest. And so thus we are losing that ability to be able to have these communications, have these nutrient transfers back and forth for these plants through the mycelium. So thus this recognition on what is going on and how vitally connected that ecosystem is in and of itself. But we also get into this idea of we are seeing the weeds in the field and that this is not good. This is something that's going to be hard. But we get again in this text, this recognition on what we are seeing at the current moment and what God is seeing over the longer haul are different. God is seeing that this type of, yes, it's going to be more labor intensive, but the reaping will not be as bad as initially thought, that this is going to be something that still can be done. Whereas a human looking at that can look like that could be near impossible and make things way more difficult to be working with. But is that not what we are also talking about here, is that there are going to be difficulties even as we are growing as wheat? And what is Jesus concerned about? Jesus is concerned about us pulling these weeds and thus damaging the crop in the long run. And this kind of ties a little bit into that Romans text on how the things that we are concerned about, the things that we are seeing right now, are things that then we get wrapped up in, but we miss the broader picture. We miss the spirit that is embedded within us. And when we actually allow ourselves to see the bigger picture, like we see with Jacob, who is running from Esau, and seeing that God is with us, God is blessing us, God is trying to do all these things if we allow ourselves to be able to see it. I think a great example of this is light in and of itself. Now, we have to remember light is both a particle and a wave, and today we're going to talk about it more in a wave sense. So there's your physics lesson for the day. But it's this recognition on how we can have waves that have more energy and less energy. And this is, again, how has been used for us to understand that we are in an expanding universe. We're able to help utilize that type of understanding of what are these different suns and different universes around us. What are they burning and how far away they are based off the light energy that's coming. This is all fine and good. But we have to remember, especially when we're looking at astronomy and trying to understand other solar systems around us, we need to have special types of telescopes to look for specific types of UV light, X-ray light, gamma ray light, to be able to understand what is it burning, how far away is it. All these things get understood with that. And it's a limitation of our own eyes. The visible light spectrum that we see is so narrow that it prevents us from seeing the gamma rays, from the ultraviolet rays, from the X-rays, from the microwaves on the longer end, from radio waves that are even longer than that. And these different sources of energy that are coming, and yet when we think about it, plants are still utilizing it, most of the time reflecting it, not necessarily absorbing it, but yet these light sources also still affect us even though we can't see it. We have an atmosphere that blocks out a lot of like the UVB rays, but that's why we use sunscreen. Sunscreen is to build another layer of protection to bounce these UVB rays and UVA rays away from us. We can see the damage that they can cause if we don't put on sunscreen. It causes cell death. It causes skin cancer based on enough exposure to it without having some type of barrier put up. Is that not what we are talking about here? Jesus understands that they're there. But if we don't get caught up in what is going on right now, we miss the aspect of if we're pulling the weeds, we can damage our own crops in the long run. Whereas if we let them grow, yes, we might have some harder harvests, maybe you get a little bit less return or things of that nature, but yet we are able to still get all of it, and it's going to outgrow that stuff where we can harvest it and then get rid of the rest. And what's going to happen? They're going to take it, they're going to burn it, which then returns those weeds down to carbon, which could be used as fertilizer for the fields. Whereas if you pull the weeds, what are you doing? You're taking them somewhere else and burning them. And are you able to throw it on your fields to be that natural fertilizer at that point? Probably not, because you're worried about the plants growing. This week, what we are seeing is more and more as humans, we get caught up in the current time, the current place, our current understanding of where things are at. But yet we have a God who doesn't work that way. We have a God that looks beyond that, beyond the current moment, beyond what we are focused on and seeing in the current time and space. And in fact, there's a lot of times what we are seeing and understanding is really very small potatoes to what is actually going on. Take plants, for instance. When they are doing photosynthesis, the reason that most plants are green is not that they are absorbing green light. They are reflecting back different bands of light that appear green. What they are not using is green. And that's what we're seeing. So what could easily be looked at is, oh, they must be absorbing green light. Wrong. They are absorbing everything else but the green light. Your rose is absorbing everything but the red light. And the understanding that and recognizing that that plant is doing that, and then even going that step further, that plants then have built in UVB protection so that they don't sunburn, unlike us, that is then already taken care of. And that these light spectrums and light that is hard on us and hard on different things and can cause damage to cells, we don't see. There's so much in this life that I think it's easy for us to overlook and not see, and thus think it's not happening. And I would argue that's what Paul is getting at in this Romans text. We get consumed with the self, we get consumed with this fleshly body, and we forget about the spiritual body in which God is concerned and where God is trying to grow. And we even see that in the Jacob text this week in Genesis, on how he's running for his life and God comes to him and says, no, don't worry. I still got you. Things are going to be okay. We look at all these different wisdoms within the Psalm and even Isaiah kind of pointing it out, this recognizing on how God knows all these things if we are willing to open ourselves up to see it and allow God to work at God's horizon and God's time frame instead of ours. We see the current problems of the weeds being in the fields and get concerned about the return and how are we going to be able to harvest this grain and what is this going to mean and what is Jesus worried about? Jesus is worried about it could potentially damage the crop. There's potentially still some benefits of that foreign adversary being there to help pass nutrients, even if it's sucking up some. But I know that my angels are better harvesters. They're going to be able to get the heads of grain without getting the weeds in there. And this is where we aren't told what type of weeds. It could be that the weeds don't grow nearly as tall as the wheat, making it easier to harvest the wheat. And like we said, that they're going to be the burning of this, and easily then that fertilizer could be brought back to the fields for the next year. Whereas if you're pulling them earlier, yes, there's a potential damage to the fields, but it's not the time to be putting fertilizer on the fields like that, of that type, in the middle of the growing season. God works on a different time horizon than we do. And so thus we need to be able to open our eyes to be able to see it. A lot of times we get caught up in the here and now, and it prevents us from really being able to see what's coming. We get consumed with this human stuff, and we miss the long-term spiritual stuff that God is trying to pour into. And when we allow ourselves to be in that long-term spiritual spot, we then get to actually start seeing what God is trying to provide, and we see the blessings that come with that when we start talking about the steadfast love, when we start talking about this fair judge, when we start talking about the sovereignty, the righteousness, compassion that we have, all comes from patience and long-term view. We have to be careful, but also very vigilant on what is our view. Are we getting consumed with right now, or are we trying to look long-term? I'll talk about an example quick here before we wrap up the podcast. This year, we have some raised beds, and especially early in the year, but I would argue this hasn't been the greatest year of return in the beds. Early on, we planted the plants and we started seeing them turn purple, which then is a sign there's different nutrients that are low. And on one of the beds, I went around the plants and put fertilizer, and I was even telling my wife, I just don't know. This year might be a loss, and we just might have to deal with it and be okay with it. And I'll think about what are some different things that we could be looking at the end of the harvest to try to bring some nutrients back in the soil. I think there's probably less nutrient in the soil, and that's still probably true. But I did still put some nutrients around certain plants. We've had a lot of rain, and over time, those nutrients have been released, and suddenly the bed that I did that in is looking better and better. The bed that I didn't do that in still continues to struggle. And I got caught up in the aspect of it doesn't look like it's going to be a good year. And so I only did it on some, and I ran out of fertilizer, never went out and got some. And now I look at the one where I did that and it's like, why? Why did I stop? The fertilizer, the ground was being woken up. The minerals and nutrients that were needed were suddenly being provided. And look what happened. My vision got so short that things weren't looking good at this moment that I got consumed with where I was a month and a half ago. And it's amazing how 30, 45 days later, I have a whole bed that looks completely different. And the scope of our faith and the scope of our life, do we do the same thing? Are we getting consumed with the light spectrum that we can see that we miss so many other things that are going on? We forget these promises that are going on. We forget the things of what God has said that God is going to do. And thus, we then get frustrated where it's like, why isn't God doing this? Or when God does something, it's like, how did I miss this? It's because we're missing the focus from the beginning. I do find it interesting that God is then saying there still might be value to those weeds being there, even though they don't appear to be. There's going to be things and nutrients it's going to pull up. And in our brain, the efficiency of that field goes down. But yet God is seeing the potential ways of nutrients still being passed around, still being easier to harvest than what we are anticipating, thinking about things in a different way. And the risk of losing one plant to doing that is not worth pulling these weeds that were sown in. And what does that say to us? The value of who we are, the value of what our faith is, the value of us having a long-term focus instead of short-term. So the question I have for you this week is, where do we need to have long-term vision instead of short-term? Where do we need to have long-term vision instead of short-term? Because as humans, we love having short-term vision. We do. We like seeing these short-term gains. We love seeing things change quickly. And yet that's not how we're designed. It takes work. It takes effort. It takes a long-term vision. And when we fix our eyes on God like that, I feel like the benefits and blessings are more than what we could have ever expected. So I think that's where we need to be. We need to be in this place of looking long term so that these other blessings can be brought along. The vision of where God is trying to bring us can be given to us. But that becomes near impossible when everything is short term. Don't get caught up in what we can only see. Make sure that we are looking at the whole picture and recognizing that there are things going on beyond what we can see, just like light, just like the mycelium in the ground being able to help pass those nutrients along, even though the field doesn't look as nice as it could be aesthetically to us with having a single monocrop there. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.